The courtroom was packed. Cameras rolled. Every seat was filled. Spectators, journalists, and politicians alike leaned forward, eager to witness what was supposed to be a humiliating defeat for Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett. Presiding over the high-profile political ethics case was none other than Judge Greg Mathis, a man known for his no-nonsense demeanor and sharp tongue. Many suspected he'd already made up his mind. The whispers around D.C. were loud. Mathis was going to make an example out of her. Jasmine, however, wasn't rattled. She walked in wearing a navy blue blazer, her expression calm but unreadable. The air tensed as Mathis opened with a warning shot. "Let's be clear, Miss Crockett," he said, his voice cutting through the silence like a knife. "This court isn't Congress, and your grandstanding won't help you here." A few reporters chuckled. Crockett didn't flinch. "With all due respect, Your Honor," she said, locking eyes with him, "I didn't come here to perform. I came to expose the truth." Judge Mathis smirked, tapping his gavel. "We'll see about that." What he didn't know, Jasmine Crockett had done her homework. She wasn't just there to defend herself, she came with documents, recordings, and a team that uncovered a conflict of interest Mathis never thought would surface. And in just a few moments, everything would start to flip. Judge Mathis leaned forward, clearly intent on setting the tone early. "This hearing concerns serious ethical violations," he declared, glancing sternly at Crockett. "You're accused of abusing your office to protect donors from federal scrutiny. So unless you have a miracle in your bag, I suggest you tread carefully." The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder. Several pundits had already predicted Crockett's political career would end today. But Jasmine simply reached into her briefcase and pulled out a thick folder, tabbed, indexed, and color-coded. She stood. "Your Honor," she said, "before you continue painting me as some corrupt official, I ask permission to enter into the record Exhibit A through D." Mathis raised an eyebrow. "Proceed," he said dismissively. She handed the clerk a stack of documents and turned to the gallery. "What you're about to see," she said confidently, "includes emails, bank records, and a sealed memo that conveniently never made it into the original investigation." Judge Mathis's eyes narrowed. He glanced over the first page, and froze. His expression shifted almost imperceptibly. "Where did you get this?" he asked, his tone suddenly colder. "Discovery," Crockett replied smoothly. "Turns out, when someone's trying to bury you, they get sloppy." Gasps echoed in the room. One reporter typed so furiously their keyboard echoed off the walls. Jasmine took one step closer to the bench. "This entire trial is based on an allegation that I intervened to shield a donor. But what this evidence shows is that the real pressure came from your office, Judge." You could hear a pin drop. Mathis's lips parted slightly, but no words came out. He hadn't expected this. And Jasmine had only just begun. Judge Mathis's fingers tapped anxiously on the bench. He scanned the pages of Exhibit B, his jaw tightening with each line. The courtroom buzzed, but Jasmine's voice sliced through it all. "Let me read a direct quote from this internal memo, dated 2 months before these charges were even filed," she said, holding up the document. "It says, coordinate with Mathis Chambers to escalate oversight pressure if Crockett resists compliance." She paused, letting the words hang heavy in the air. "This wasn't about ethics," she continued. "This was about political intimidation dressed up as justice." Mathis tried to regain control. "That document proves nothing," he snapped. "It could have been fabricated." Jasmine didn't flinch. She nodded to her attorney, who immediately stood and presented a sworn affidavit from the staffer who originally authored the memo. "Your Honor, this affidavit verifies the authenticity of the memo," the attorney said. "And more importantly, it states the staffer was threatened with termination if they spoke about it publicly." The gallery erupted in murmurs. Journalists were already texting their editors. A congressional staffer near the back stood up in disbelief. Judge Mathis, now visibly unsettled, tried to suppress the eruption. "Order. I said order in this courtroom. But the shift had already begun. The narrative flipped. For the first time since the proceedings began, Mathis didn't look like the man in charge, he looked cornered. And Jasmine Crockett? She leaned forward, her voice steady. You tried to break me. You tried to humiliate me. But I'm not afraid of power, Judge. Especially when it's being abused. Her words thundered through the chamber. And Mathis realized, he was losing control of the trial. Judge Mathis stared down at the affidavit, but his authority, once absolute, was crumbling by the second. He cleared his throat, trying to reassert dominance. These claims are outrageous, he said tightly. This court does not entertain conspiracy theories. Jasmine didn't blink. Neither do I, she said sharply. That's why I brought receipts. She turned toward the projector screen behind her legal team. With a single nod, her assistant clicked the remote, and up came a grainy video recording. It was time-stamped, verified, and watermarked. In it, a senior official, one of Mathis's close allies, was seen in a private meeting discussing ways to corner Crockett legally, and force her hand with the help of a friendly judge. The courtroom erupted. Gasps. Shouting. Even Mathis's bailiff looked shaken. This video, Jasmine said, voice unwavering, was recorded legally. And it's been verified by a digital forensic analyst. The person speaking is Harold Brenton, your former advisor, Judge. Mathis's face drained of color. This is absurd, he muttered. You're twisting things. No, you twisted the justice system, she interrupted, standing taller. You wanted to humiliate me. Instead, you exposed yourself. The tension snapped like a live wire. Reporters scrambled out of the courtroom to file breaking stories. The headline was already writing itself, Jasmine Crockett turns the tables, Judge Mathis under fire. The judge slammed his gavel. Enough. I will not be tried in my own courtroom. Jasmine's final words before sitting down silenced the room. Then maybe, Your Honor, you should recuse yourself, before someone higher up makes that decision for you. The crowd froze. Because everyone knew, the game had changed. And Mathis wasn't calling the shots anymore, the courtroom was stunned. Judge Mathis sat stiffly behind the bench, his gavel still in hand, but its authority now symbolic at best. The words recuse yourself echoed through the walls like a siren. Crockett's legal team quietly slid another folder across the table. Inside, a copy of a sealed complaint that had just been filed with the Judicial Conduct Review Board, hours before the hearing began. Jasmine stood again. Your Honor, she said, cool and commanding, this complaint outlines a pattern of conduct that points to a conflict of interest. Multiple cases over the last year, all with political undertones, all assigned to you. Mathis' jaw clenched. Are you accusing me of corruption? No, Jasmine replied. I'm presenting the facts. Let the people decide what they see. Then came the real shock. Her attorney handed over an internal email chain between Judge Mathis and an unnamed party, dated 3 weeks before charges were filed. In the emails, Mathis had referenced Crockett by name. He wrote that she needed to be taken down a peg and that she thinks she's untouchable. This was no longer a case. It was a setup. And now, the receipts were public. So, tell me, Your Honor, Jasmine said, locking eyes with him, were you interested in the law, or revenge? The audience gasped. Mathis opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Suddenly, a voice from the back of the room called out, motion to have the judge removed. More murmurs. A second voice shouted, he's compromised. The bailiff stepped forward, unsure whether to restore order or protect the judge. Mathis looked around the room, once his arena, and realized what everyone else already had, he was no longer in control. And Jasmine Crockett wasn't on trial anymore. She was delivering judgment. Judge Mathis sat frozen as the courtroom around him erupted into chaos. Clerks exchanged frantic glances. Reporters were already live streaming from their phones. Members of the public in the gallery shouted for an investigation, while Crockett stood calmly, her expression sharp, composed, and utterly unshaken. For the first time in his career, Greg Mathis looked rattled. He reached for his gavel again, but this time it was purely reflex, the authority behind it had shattered. "This court is still in session," he shouted. "I will not tolerate this circus." But no one was listening. Crockett slowly approached the bench, her voice low but commanding. "You built this circus, Judge," she said. "You orchestrated a political takedown, manipulated a court process, and underestimated one very important thing." She paused. "I don't fold. Ever." Her attorney stepped forward and addressed the clerk directly. "Your Honor," he said, deliberately not looking at Mathis, "we are officially filing a motion to disqualify Judge Mathis from these proceedings. On the grounds of personal bias, misconduct, and premeditated abuse of judicial authority." A second later, the courtroom doors swung open. 2 federal observers from the Judicial Oversight Commission entered, having been alerted by Crockett's legal team hours earlier. Their presence was the final blow. Even Mathis couldn't pretend things were normal anymore. "We'll take it from here," one of the officials said curtly. Jasmine turned, nodded respectfully to the observers, and returned to her seat. The judge who had planned to humiliate her was now being escorted to chambers for questioning. Not a single camera turned away. The narrative had flipped in real time. Jasmine Crockett hadn't just defended herself, she dismantled the trap. And everyone in that courtroom witnessed the fall of a man who thought he was untouchable. The doors shut behind Judge Mathis as the federal observers led him out of the courtroom. The atmosphere shifted, not just in tone, but in power. The courtroom no longer felt like his domain. It belonged, unmistakably, to Jasmine Crockett. One of the observers stepped up to the bench. "This court is now in recess pending judicial reassignment," she announced. "All matters involving Judge Mathis's rulings will be subject to internal review." The room buzzed again, this time not with chaos, but disbelief. A sitting judge, publicly removed during a trial? Unprecedented. Crockett exhaled deeply but quietly. She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She simply leaned over to her legal counsel and whispered, "Now we make sure it sticks." While reporters rushed outside to broadcast the historic moment, Jasmine remained at the table, calmly organizing her files. A young congressional aide approached her cautiously. "Congresswoman, how did you know?" She looked up. "I pay attention when people get too bold," she replied. Mathis overplayed his hand. He wanted to humiliate me in public, and in doing so, he exposed his own arrogance. Outside the courthouse, a storm of flashing lights and questions awaited. News networks across the country interrupted programming to air the footage of Judge Mathis being removed. Meanwhile, Jasmine Crockett walked out the main doors, not as a disgraced politician, but as the woman who turned a courtroom ambush into a historic reckoning. Microphones rushed toward her. "Congresswoman Crockett, do you have a statement?" She paused, turned to the cameras, and delivered it with chilling clarity. "This wasn't just about me. This was about every public servant who's ever been targeted for doing the right thing. To those watching, don't just survive the trap. Burn it down." The crowd roared. And across the country, the story of how a judge tried to humiliate Jasmine Crockett, and got destroyed in the process, became legend. By the time Jasmine Crockett returned to her office that evening, the headlines had gone nuclear. Judge Mathis removed mid-trial after Crockett exposes bombshell evidence. Jasmine Crockett flips the courtroom, turns defense into devastation. Legal earthquake. Judge accused of political retaliation scheme. Cable news hosts who had once mocked her were now scrambling to revise their narratives. Her inbox overflowed with messages, from supporters, from stunned colleagues, and from insiders who had stayed quiet for far too long. But Jasmine wasn't celebrating. She was already planning her next move. She called an emergency press conference that night. The room was packed tighter than ever. Journalists, activists, even rival politicians showed up. Tonight, she began, we're not just talking about a courtroom. We're talking about a system that enables people in power to weaponize the law for personal and political gain. Flashes flickered. Cameras zoomed in. Judge Mathis tried to put me on trial. But what he didn't expect, she said, voice sharp, was that I'd bring his behavior to light, in front of the very people he thought he controlled. Then came the announcement that sent shockwaves across D.C., effective immediately. I'm introducing legislation to create an independent oversight panel for judicial ethics, beyond partisan influence, and fully transparent to the public. The room erupted. This wasn't just a courtroom reversal. It was a full-blown counteroffensive. Jasmine Crockett had taken the attempted humiliation and turned it into a nationwide movement. The fallout from the trial had become bigger than just her, it was a spark in a powder keg of accountability. And as she left the press room, flanked by supporters and security alike, one reporter called out, "Congresswoman, what would you say to Judge Mathis right now?" She stopped. Looked dead into the camera. "Thank you for underestimating me." Then she walked off. And the nation knew, the fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. The very next morning, Capitol Hill was ablaze with speculation. Judge Mathis had gone silent, his chambers issued a vague, no-comment, statement, while multiple judicial conduct investigators were seen entering and leaving his office. Whispers swirled that resignations were being considered. Staffers were lawyering up. Meanwhile, Jasmine Crockett's office became the epicenter of a political aftershock. Dozens of House members, some quietly skeptical of her before, now reached out to co-sponsor her proposed Judicial Transparency and Integrity Act. Even her usual opponents in committee meetings were suddenly silent, or supportive. But Jasmine wasn't interested in victory laps. She gathered her team behind closed doors. "This is bigger than me," she said firmly. "This is about sending a message to every judge, politician, and power broker who thinks they can manipulate the system and walk away clean." One aide cautiously spoke up, "There's talk of retaliation. Some of Mathis's allies are trying to discredit the video and the memo." Jasmine nodded. "Let them try. We've got timestamps, signatures, chain of custody, and public opinion on our side." She turned to her press secretary. "I want a town hall set up, live, public, unfiltered. Let people ask whatever they want. No scripts. Let them see I've got nothing to hide." By that evening, the town hall streamed to millions. And Crockett did not hold back. She fielded every question, from college students, veterans, legal scholars, and even a former federal judge who called in just to say, "You did what most politicians never dare, you stood up and swung back, and you did it with evidence." The final question of the night came from a mother in Ohio. "How do you stay standing when they come for you like that?" Jasmine paused, her expression softening just slightly. "Because I remember who I represent," she said. "And I refuse to let people who abuse power define what justice looks like in this country." The audience stood in thunderous applause. And somewhere, in the silence of a private office, Judge Mathis watched it unfold on TV, alone, his reputation crumbling by the second. The fallout was swift. Within 72 hours of Jasmine Crockett's bombshell courtroom takedown and public town hall, Judge Greg Mathis was formally suspended pending a full judicial review. The Oversight Board launched a sweeping investigation, not just into his handling of Crockett's case, but into dozens of rulings now under question. Whistleblowers came forward. Old colleagues distanced themselves. And quietly, without cameras or press releases, Mathis submitted his resignation to avoid a public trial of his own. Meanwhile, Jasmine Crockett didn't stop. Her proposed Judicial Transparency and Integrity Act picked up bipartisan momentum, quickly becoming one of the most closely watched legislative efforts in recent memory. On the House floor, she delivered a searing speech. "What happened to me wasn't an exception, it's a warning. If justice can be twisted behind closed doors for personal gain, then none of us are truly free. We must rip the curtain down, permanently. The room went silent. And then, applause. Reluctant from some corners, roaring from others. Outside the Capitol, protesters held signs not just with Jasmine's name, but with messages like, "Power isn't above accountability," and "No more Mathis justice." Reporters surrounded her as she left the chamber, but this time, she didn't stop to speak. She just looked into the camera, nodded once, and walked on, not as a defendant, not as a politician on defense, but as a symbol of resistance who flipped a courtroom, rewrote the narrative, and dismantled a power play in front of the entire nation. Judge Mathis had tried to humiliate her. But Jasmine Crockett turned his courtroom into a cautionary tale, and emerged not just unbroken, but unstoppable. Weeks passed, but the shockwaves from the Crockett-Mathis showdown refused to fade. Major media outlets dubbed it the trial that backfired, and documentaries were already in development. Political analysts called it a once-in-a-generation moment, when a sitting judge tried to destroy a rising political figure, and ended up triggering his own downfall instead. But for Jasmine Crockett, the real work had just begun. Behind the scenes, she was building something bigger, a coalition. Civil rights leaders, legal scholars, young lawmakers, and grassroots organizers came together, not around partisanship, but around a shared truth, that justice needed sunlight, not shadows. And Jasmine had become the lightning rod. She launched the Justice Integrity Tour, visiting courthouses, universities, and community centers across the country. Every stop was packed. People didn't just want to hear her story, they wanted to be part of what came next. At one event, a young law student stood up and asked, "How do you keep going after everything they tried to do to you?" Jasmine smiled, but there was fire behind it. "Because every time they try to silence me, I remember, they're not afraid of my voice. They're afraid of the truth I bring with it." In Washington, Judge Mathis's name had all but vanished from conversation. He was now a cautionary footnote in a political transformation he tried to prevent. But Jasmine Crockett? She was just getting started. Her approval numbers soared. National news began whispering about her as a future committee chair, even a Senate run. But for now, she stayed grounded. Because the courtroom where someone tried to humiliate her had become the battlefield where she proved what happens when truth isn't just defended, it's unleashed. And in that moment, the message rang clear from coast to coast: never underestimate a woman with receipts, resilience, and a righteous cause. Months later, Jasmine Crockett stood once again at a podium, but this time, it wasn't in a courtroom or on the House floor. It was in front of the Judicial Oversight Reform Summit, where legal minds, lawmakers, and civil rights leaders had gathered from across the country to honor her work. The spotlight was bright, but Jasmine stood firm, not as a survivor of political sabotage, but as the architect of reform. "What began as an attempt to tear me down," she said, her voice steady, "became a movement to rebuild trust in the system that tried to break me." Behind her, a massive screen displayed the words, "The Crockett Doctrine, a new era of judicial accountability." Her legislation had passed with overwhelming support. Judges were now required to disclose all prior political associations tied to active cases. A public database had been launched to track judicial misconduct claims. For the first time in U.S. history, citizen review panels were given oversight power alongside legal experts. The entire landscape had shifted, because one woman refused to stay quiet when she was being railroaded. After the summit, Jasmine stepped outside into a sea of flashing cameras. A journalist asked, "What's next for you, Congresswoman? Senate? Governor?" She smiled, but shook her head. "Justice isn't a stepping stone. It's a destination. And I'm not done walking toward it." As she walked off into a crowd of supporters, activists, students, and community leaders, it became clear that the trial Judge Mathis thought would end Jasmine Crockett's career had instead cemented her legacy. He tried to humiliate her in his courtroom. Instead, she rewrote the rules. She flipped the trial. She destroyed the trap. And in doing so, she didn't just win. She changed the system.